live then. Going live, and we're live. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for dropping in to see Dr. Sos Eltis' lecture on A Streetcar Named Desire, Me Too and the Critics. I'm Alfie, I'm the Outreach and Admissions Officer at the English faculty. My pronouns are he, him, and if you have any questions about applying or about how you can do more and connect with the faculty, please feel free to email me at undergraduate.admissions@ell.ox.ac.uk. It's always in my mind, I have to reel that one out. So now I'll hand over to Sos.
Hi, I'm Sos Eltis. I'm one of the English tutors at Brasenose. Apologies for the change of lecture title. If you'd seen me down as lecturing on Oscar Wilde and Sherlock Holmes, basically because it's 2 lectures back to back on each day, we decided that as one of them is cached on YouTube, so you can, if you are interested in what I did have to say on Oscar Wilde and Sherlock Holmes, then feel free to go on the faculty website and have a watch of that, or on YouTube. But we thought maybe offer something different. So as Streetcar's very popular A-level text, went for that. I didn't just write this overnight, I'm not that mad. But also I should warn you, trigger warnings. One of the things I'm going to be concentrating on is the rape at the end of Streetcar Named Desire, not in huge graphic detail, but fair trigger warning on the fact that that is part of the subject matter. So that said, here we go. And do feel free to post questions and all the rest of it. I'd love to respond. So I'm going to attempt.
Pop them in the comment section below, because over on Slido we've got a mature students Q&A.
That it? Got it up there? Alfie, compound. Cool. So, Streetcar Named Desire, hashtag Me Too and the Critics. Now, when I put Me Too in the title, what I'm really referring to is not so much the specific movement, but the call that's included in Me Too to recognise sexual violence, not as an expression of desire, but as an exercise and abuse of power, which I think is hugely relevant to the role of sexual violence within Streetcar Named Desire. Now, this lecture starts with the fact that a huge number, I find, of critics, theatre reviewers and so on hedge around the rape at the end of Streetcar. They excuse it, justify it, erase it, dismiss it, or essentially accept Stanley's assertion that, quote, we've had this date with each other from the beginning. So what I want to do is look at the relation between sexual attitudes and interpretations of the play, how responses to female desire and female sexuality have inflected the reception of the play, and look at questions of how they relate to an understanding of the play's meanings, its resonance and significance. Ultimately, looking at the ways in which sexual attitudes and interpretation are inextricably entwined. So issues of sexual morality do not lie at the side of the play, they're not a side thing. And in many ways, this speaks to the question of literary meaning, of how we interpret texts, and the fact that who we are and how we see the world is part of what we bring to our interpretation, and looking at the sort of critical history of reception of the play. Now, in non-literary terms, the failure of critics to call out Stanley as a rapist is obviously depressing, but I have to say in non-literary terms, not entirely unsurprising. So Blanche's case, if we see it in, again, non-official literary terms, would never make it to court, let's face it, let alone secure a conviction. Blanche is the ultimate unreliable witness. She's drunk, she's flirtatious, she deploys her sexual attractiveness with calculated intent. She is mendacious, and she has a rich sexual history, including possibly selling sex for money. And add to that the fact that the sort of social culture of the play itself, within the play itself, is what you could term rape culture. So not only Stanley's assault upon Blanche, but also the fact that Mitch rather half-heartedly tries to take, quote, what I have been missing all summer from Blanche, in the sense that sex is owed him for the drinks and the dinners he's bought and so on. So that sense of sexual entitlement is kind of written into the culture. It's part of what Williams is portraying there. Now, these kind of attitudes are strongly reflected in reviews over the years. Most notably, I think, if you look at reception of the play in America back in 1947 when it was first performed. So Life magazine in 1947, just after the premiere of the play, published photos, stills from the play, together with captions, which included that of this graphic scene of Blanche being restrained by the doctor and the matron, where the legend concluded that Blanche's sister and husband, so Stella's sister and Blanche's sister Stella and her husband can, quote, now resume their happiness, proving Williams's thesis that healthy life can go on only after it is rid of unwholesome influences. And then in another photo, which was of the rape itself, Life declared that for weeks Blanche, had been insulting and trying to attract him. When his wife is in hospital having a baby, Blanche hysterically attacks him with the top of a broken bottle. In a half-drunken fury, Stanley rapes her. Similar time, that's back in 1947, where they're declaring that, sort of resuming your marriage to a rapist is the resumption of happiness after he's raped your sister. But even in 2020, some I find slightly dubious kind of statements. So, for example, Patrick Marmion in the Daily Mail commented of Ben Foster playing Stanley that he's the kind of seamy muscleman you might expect to find clearing your drains, but while it is important to condemn domestic violence, he needs some of Brando's sex appeal to leaven the darker currents. I love the sort of brush away of it's important to condemn sexual violence, but apparently if your rapist is attractive, it leavens the darker undercurrents. Really don't want to go into what he's exactly saying there, but or in this case, in the Daily Mail, we have Quentin Letts declaring that a sister-in-law like this Blanche would send any man round the twist, but with an ogre such as Stanley, the only surprise is that he does not explode sooner and more frequently. Yes, okay, so apparently it's all Blanche's fault and the result is inevitable. Even goes through to 1997, you have John Gross writing in the Daily Telegraph about Jessica Lange as Blanche and Alec Baldwin as Stanley, that Blanche, quote, can't help being fascinated by his rough masculinity, and she, quote, half provokes the scene in which he eventually rapes her. This despite the fact that Gross, the reviewer who wrote this, declares himself disappointed at the absence of sexual chemistry between Blanche and Stanley. In other words, he assumes the sexual attraction, which somehow justifies, half invites the rape, despite the fact it isn't even there. So there are some really, let us say, interesting sexual attitudes running through these reviews. The most I find troubling and remarkable example of this is a 2009 article in an American journal by John S. Back, an article entitled A Streetcar Named Dies Irae, Tennessee Williams and the Semiotics of Rape. Now, Back asserts that the rape should be read symbolically. He, by the way, notes that as a homosexual cruising for trade, Tennessee Williams never saw sex as a matter purely of tenderness. And we'll come back at the end to some of these kind of ways in which Tennessee Williams's sexuality is invoked in ways to try and not even excuse, just kind of twist around, read the rape. But Back goes on to claim that the rape is, quote, a spiritual reckoning for Blanche, and that Stanley's rape of her has, quote, a salubrious effect in destroying her, quote, desire for the flesh that has completely consumed her. I mean, apparently this is some kind of corrective rape in those terms. These are, I mean, I have to find kind of extraordinary in some ways, but the point is, what I want to look at is not so much these number of frankly lamentable attitudes. Our critics need to do some better critical thinking, frankly, but actually to look at how these attitudes inflect readings of the play, to look at the relation between the two, which speak to questions about how plays have meaning, how we understand things, how plays say things, and this inseparability of cultural attitudes and the meanings and resonance of the works themselves. So not just what the critics are saying about the play and what the play says about the critics, but how these open out the play's meanings, resonances, and implications. Now, if we go back to Tennessee Williams himself, he himself saw the rape as crucial to the meanings of the play. So he strongly resisted in 1951 when film censors wanted to cut the rape from the film. And Williams threatened to dissociate himself completely from the film and wrote an impassioned letter to the censor Breen saying, "Streetcar is an extremely and peculiarly moral play in the deepest and truest sense of the term. The Rape of Blanche by Stanley is a pivotal, integral truth in the play, without which the play loses its meaning, which is the ravishment of the tender, the sensitive, the delicate by the savage and brutal forces in modern society. It is a poetic plea for comprehension." So the rape it is important that it's an assertion of power, and it's important in much larger, you could say, symbolic terms for Williams. Now, the end of the play was actually altered at the insistence of the censors for the film, so that Stella was not seen to return to Stanley. And before you get too excited about this, the idea that it's sort of getting things in proportion and not seeing that sort of wife returning to the husband who just raped her sister, as, you know, recognizing that, it must be noted that the censors explained this rewriting, the keeping Stella away from Stanley at the end, as because Stanley must be punished for his, quote, lust. So again, it's reading the rape as driven by desire, not reading it as an assertion of power or an act of deliberate destruction, which is much more how Williams, if you note above, is describing it. So, you know, not that many prizes to the censors for that one. And importantly, the film censors for that 1951 film, which is almost certainly the way that most people have seen the play, received it in that famous Brando performance, the film censors also insisted on significant changes to the footage where Stella returns to Stanley after he's hit her, when she descends the stairs from Eunice's apartment. Now, this is described by the film critic Roger Ebert, who saw the uncut version and the shots that were finally restored in a later version. As he says, in the uncut version, only a couple of shots are different, but what a difference they make. Stella's whole demeanor seems different, seems charged with lust. In the apartment, she responds more visibly to his voice. On the stairs, there are close-ups as she descends, showing her face almost blank with desire. And the closing embrace, which looks in the cut version as if she were consoling him, looks in the uncut version as if she has abandoned herself to him. So what the censors are taking out here is active female desire, the narcotized sexuality that Williams refers to. So really importantly, there's a kind of distaste behind the film with female sexuality itself. It's something that's troubling for the censors. So it's not just about Stanley and Blanche, it's also about Stella's role in that, and that's worth remembering. So if we look at this key early reception, there was a big split in many ways between American and UK responses to the premiere of the play back in 1949. So the English reception of both play and film were a relative failure. And that, I would argue, was rooted in critics' attitudes to female sexuality. So Blanche was repeatedly described in English production. This was the English premiere cast. So Bona Colliano playing Stanley and Vivian Leigh as Blanche. Blanche was played by Jessica Tandy in the American premiere. So English critics repeatedly describe Blanche as a nymphomaniac, a prostitute, and a loose woman. As the New York Times critics noted of the English reception of the play, that whereas the play was seen as high-flown drama in the States, in England, it was just seen as, quote, fly-blown melodrama, a play about an inconvenient in-law who comes and critics showing huge sympathy for Stanley. So, for example, the Manchester Guardian in 1949 described Blanche as a New Orleans Madame Bovary who, quote, destroys herself by self-dramatization, whereas Stanley is described as earthy but ethical, a man who has, quote, more morals up to a point than manners. And the Times, the London Times, dismissed this preposterous lady of leisure as a loose woman, and noted that Mr. Williams develops the favourite illusion of nearly all dramatists that hardened prostitutes are capable of a touching sentimental gesture. Whereas Stanley was described by the Times as a primitive but satisfactory husband. Right, so those are the kind of English attitudes to the play. And I think some of the reasoning for that you could see perhaps in the casting of Vivien Leigh. Now, this is on the left here, you have a still from that production, and on the right, which was used as part of the publicity for the English premiere, and on the right, you have Vivien Leigh in Gone with the Wind. If you notice, there's an interesting parallel, certainly between the cleavage that's being displayed for both, but in the posture. Now, on the right, this moment that ends up on the poster of Gone with the Wind is a moment where, what's her name? Scarlett is being basically carried up the stairs by Rhett, her husband, at a point where he then rapes her. And in the film, it's not just marital rape, it's marital rape where she wakes up the next morning kind of purring with satisfaction, and basically tamed and brought in line by this. So there's a way in which this, I would argue, maybe this reference that's going on between the two texts is influencing British critics. There's a way in which the rape is being softened into something, again, this idea of the kind of corrective rape or whatever else, something half consensual that the woman's asking for, and that the visual echoing that's happening between the two is part of that. And if you look at critics writing about it, they're certainly referencing Gone with the Wind within that. So there's a point where there's in the Observer, for example, the estate that Blanche has lost is described as having, quote, gone with the wind. So it's absolutely part of their kind of framework as they're receiving the play. Now, this is in stark contrast to American reviews. American reviewers, a large number of them, see a huge resonance in the play, something that goes far beyond this kind of melodrama of individuals. So, for example, Brooke Atkinson in the New York Times in 1947 describes Blanche as one of the dispossessed, whose experience has unfitted her for reality, and says of Williams that out of poetic imagination and ordinary compassion, he has spun a poignant and luminous story. Walcott Gibbs in the New Yorker similarly summed up Streetcar as a brilliant, implacable play about the disintegration of a woman, or if you like, a society. So what you have is American reviewers seeing a sort of huge resonance here, reading the play in much larger symbolic terms, where British reviewers are displaying this kind of incredible misogynist, frankly, distaste for female sexuality, and seeing it as purely a drama of three people, one of whom is a loose woman and pretty much worthless within that. So they're seeing no greater resonance within it. So the meanings of the play seem to be incredibly tightly tied into the sort of distaste for active female desire. Now, it's worth noting that Tennessee Williams himself was not critical of female desire itself. If you have any doubts about that, I would recommend that you read or look at his play, The Rose Tattoo, which is the most wonderful celebration of female desire as a kind of life force. And I would argue that this acceptance of female desire, if what you want to do is access the meanings that were there for contemporary American audiences, that were there in the ways that Williams wrote about the play, you really have to think about this issue of what role sexuality is playing in the play. And this isn't just about getting back to an American context where you think about in sort of symbolic terms that Blanche is the Old South and Stanley is brush new industrialized North. It's much more subtle than that. What Williams is interested in, and certainly what contemporary, back in the 1940s and 1950s, American reviewers saw in the play, was a battle for the country's soul, indeed a battle for the soul of the future. And this is a battle, this is a much larger things at stake, that misogynist attitudes to female sexuality hopelessly obstruct. They kind of close off this sense of the wider and subtler significance of the play. So, for example, the leading American director and critic, Harold Clurman, wrote of the play at its reception in 1948, Some reviewers thought Blanche Dubois a boozy prostitute, and others believed her a nymphomaniac. Such designations are not only inaccurate, but reveal a total failure to understand the author's intention and the theme of the play. Tennessee Williams is a poet of frustration, and what his play says is that aspiration, sensitivity, departure from the norm are battered, bruised, and disgraced in our world. It will be far truer to think of Blanche Dubois as the potential artist in all of us than as a deteriorated Southern belle. And he continues, her amatory adventures, which her brother-in-law, like some of the critics, regards as the mark of her inferiority, are the unwholesome means she uses to maintain her connection with life, to fight the sense of death, which her whole background has created in her. The play's story shows us Blanche is seeking haven in a simple, healthy man, and that in this too she is defeated, because everything in her environment conspires to degrade the meaning of her tragic situation. Her lies are part of her will to beauty. Her wretched romanticism is a futile reaching towards a fullness of life. She is not a drunkard and she is not insane when she's committed to an asylum. She is an almost willing victim of a world that has trapped her and in which she can find peace only by accepting the verdict of her unfitness for normal life. Now, Clermont puts this, Blanche, as in his words, representing the essence of womanly feeling and wounded human sensibility, describing her as an aristocrat in the subtlety and depth of her feeling, declaring she is superior by the sheer intensity and realization of experience, even if much of what she does is abject. He contrasts this with Stanley, who he declares is the embodiment of animal force, of brute life, unconcerned and even consciously scornful of every value that does not come within the scope of such life. He is all muscle, lumpish sensuality and crude energy, given support by a society that hardly demands more of him. He is the unwitting antichrist of our time, the little man who will break the back of every effort to create a more comprehensive world in which thought and conscience, a broader humanity, are expected to evolve from the old Adam. His mentality provides the soil for fascism, viewed not as a political movement, but a state of being. So what you have there is very, very far from some kind of melodrama of sordid sexuality. What you have there is a battle for fundamental human qualities, where Blanche is about vision and empathy and compassion and the love of beauty, and Stanley, the Antichrist, the fascist, is about brutality and reducing and destroying exactly those aspirations which show up his brutality, his littleness, his pure physicality. So that is what so many American critics saw in the play, and that is what is utterly inaccessible to English critics who are obsessed with the dirtiness of female sexuality. That completely obscures these other meanings. Now, Clermont carries on to note that these meanings were occluded, were blocked off in some ways by the original Broadway performance. He saw Jessica Tandy playing Blanche as too narrow in her emotional range to deliver the depth of Blanche's feeling. And he also felt that Brando's quality of acute sensitivity, his almost lyrical personality, endowed Stanley with a touching pain. So even if he hits Stella or throws the radio out of the window, these acts, he said, take on an almost Dostoevskian aspect. So there's a huge question here about how you understand, particularly with a play, which is dependent on performance, where do the meanings lie? And how far that it's one of the fascinating things about studying theatre is how far the performance is the work in many ways, and that casting and performance can completely change those kind of resonances. Now, similarly, one of the crucial things that these critics pick out in performance of the play is that Blanche herself must believe in the poetry, that in all her fakery and all her posing, her belief in poetry and beauty, in what makes us more than animals, is absolutely core to her. If she's faking that, then, as New York Times critic Bill and Brantley put it, to present all that as mere pretense is to turn Blanche into another self-serving struggler in a Darwinian world. She too, to use her words, has come to hang back with the brutes. So it's crucial she really believes in those qualities. Now, it's a rare English production that has managed to achieve this, to convey that sense. One, I would argue, was the 2009 really wonderful performance by Rachel Weisz in the Donmar production of the play, of a production where she's not only beautiful, but wistful, imaginative, compassionate, hugely self-conscious, so beautifully self-mocking, but also deeply, delicately yearning. Her performance was described by Benedict Nightingale at the Times as having the intelligence, the wry humour, the yearning for love and the capacity to express it, the warmth, the radiance thwarted by circumstances. Indeed, the key qualities that make her Williams's most striking creation. Now, attitudes alongside that sort of recognition, I think really crucially for understanding the play, it's these attitudes to Blanche's and Stella's sexual desire that are key to any reading. So you can't set them aside. You can't just criticize the critics on one sense and see the play as standing, that whatever any readers or viewers sort of attitudes are, feed into their understanding of the play. So for Clerman's or Atkinson's reading to resonate, Blanche's sexual appetite needs to be understood not as an impulse towards death and the cemetery, not something necessarily dirty, degraded and self-destructive, but actually as the opposite of a death wish, as a repudiation of death and a will to live and love. So the fact that she has sex with lots of men is part of her search for beauty. It's not something degraded and disgusting. So in that sense, it's very hard that the sort of symbolic meaning of that depends on your understanding, basically, of female desire. Stanley's world is one purely of physical pleasures, and the rape is his brutal defense of himself against Blanche's influence and the threat that she will awaken Stella from her, quote, narcotized sexuality. So whereas early English critics embraced Stella as a breath of fresh air, she was a marital sex, that her desire for Stanley was seen as a key to a happy, healthy, reproductive marriage, it's notable that only very recently have critics started questioning that relationship between Stanley and Stella. So it was only in a 2014 production of the play, the National Theatre's production with Gillian Anderson as Blanche, that Kate Bassett noted of the play that the assaults and sex normally left off stage invest the streetcar with fresh, raw power, particularly exploring the disturbing fine line between ardor and domestic abuse in Stanley and Stella's relationship. So she comments, Vanessa Kirby's Listen Stella is strikingly libidinous with a masochistic streak. So the abusiveness within that relationship, the kind of power thing, is something that was only very recently recognized by reviewers, and again, changes those meanings of the play, makes you kind of re-look at the end of the play in all sorts of ways. Now, alongside this, just looking at the kind of evolution of critical debate around the play, I've noted a recent tendency to conflate Blanche with Tennessee Williams himself, and to read her through his presumed sexual habits and appetites, notably the idea that he had a taste for rough sex. And I would question, this might sound enlightened in some ways as reviewers deliver it, but it also, I think, is another way of erasing and avoiding female desire, and perhaps another way of trying to frame Stanley's rape of Stella as in some ways consensual, in some ways wished for by Stella, now wished for by Stella in the form of she's a kind of avatar for Tennessee Williams himself and his taste for rough trade, as these critics put it. So, for example, Benedict Nightingale comments of Tennessee Williams, he felt his way under her skin because, in a sense, he was Blanche Dubois himself, a southerner with a nostalgia for the Eden he believed he had been ruined by the cruel and brutal, a gay man in whom a hankering for purity clashed with a taste for rough trade. Or Peter Bradshaw, a film critic who I love in lots of ways, wrote in The Guardian in 2020, my own view is that Williams has ventriloquized and heterosexualized his own sensibilities into Blanche. This is a fictional variant of a gay man doing the tense bickering and bantering with half-naked Stanley, and perhaps delicately kissing a young boy on the lips. Only in this context can you understand Stanley's puzzled unease and contempt. Now, yes, there's all sorts of ways of trying to ask questions about the author's sexual attitudes and values and how they play into the play, but I'm also wary of any reading that tries to erase the actual existence of the heroine herself. So she becomes merely a kind of heterosexualized gay man in that sense. So I think there are all sorts of questions here about how that kind of reading in another way erases female desire, suggests a different kind of way of having trouble seeing it as a life wish rather than a death wish. Now, what do all of these add up to? Not necessarily giving critics marks out of 10 for their wokeness or their sensitivity to sexual violence, though quite clearly many of them do not get many marks if that were the game we're playing, but that's not the game I'm trying to play. What I'm trying to do is demonstrate the ways in which sexual attitudes do not stand on one side from literary analysis. They are part and parcel of it. We all bring our own assumptions and values and responses to them. And in that sense, it's not just about trying to access the meanings, the intentionality that Williams may have had, because in many ways we're absolutely aware of the fact that author's intention doesn't decide what a play means. It means that what we can do is look at the ways that the meaning morphs and changes in different contexts, in between the British and American context, in the context of other works being produced, so like Gone with the Wind, giving another one. It's also important to our understanding that instability of not just literary text, but particularly dramatic texts, the ways in which they mean different things and become different plays to different audiences. But I think also a really interesting thing here is if you can look at how far post Me Too, actually in many ways, if you noticed, if you go back to Harold Clurman and what the play was meaning to him in 1948, it seems to me that critics have come closest to that very, very recently. That there's a kind of massive loop that's happened over about the last 50 or 60 years where changing and evolving sexual attitudes have actually in interesting ways brought audiences and critics back closer perhaps to Tennessee Williams' vision and views. It's fascinating in that it's not just a single line, it's a kind of constantly morphing landscape. But one in which hopefully you share my fascination with it, but those ways in which the play comes to mean different things and never stops meaning in that sense.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sos. That was a very engaging lecture. As we wait for a few comments to come through in the comment section below, this is interesting. You picked up some of the things that Emma and I were talking about after her Shakespeare in Context lecture earlier today, notably about how certain actors and portrayals bring different things to light from the text. Do you think there has been, I know you mentioned some specific performances, but a really standout performance that you think exemplifies exactly what Tennessee Williams had intended?
Well, to me, of all the performances I've seen, Rachel Weisz's was the one that did that extraordinarily. I mean, I think she put across the intelligence of Blanche, how far Blanche is this kind of self-conscious commentator on her own performance, which forms a really interesting, I think, bond with the audience, potentially, because it's a kind of, she's commenting on her own performance in a way that's almost sort of like, rather like those Shakespearean actors who are sort of referencing the audience as they speak. There's a very interesting kind of self-conscious theatricality there. And I think in the other way, Marlon Brando's performance has almost permanently sort of inflected that play the other way. So that when Stanley makes his big speech about being king in his own house and, you know, the kind of the rights of the worker and everything else, and at the premiere in America, there was huge applause for that. And apparently Tennessee Williams backstage muttered, the animals always go for the animals. So it was not how he'd intended or how he saw that speech necessarily playing out. He could sort of sense the way in which Brando was really bonding, you know, drawing out the audience in sympathy there. And I think that's become a kind of sensitivity in many ways that all the actors playing Stanley after that, they're trying to be Brando in some ways. So it's fascinating that for the different meanings that the plays can take on. But those are, and in that sense, it's one of the reasons I love studying theatre. The ways that every performance changes what the play means. It's constantly It's not that the text is a blueprint for performance. It's a starting point for it to morph into so many different creatures, and often different creatures according to the audience. It's not just the actors that change it, it's the audience themselves. And I think that's why often we end up talking about text and context as though you've got one is complete and then you sort of put it in this sort of surrounding liquid or something like that. Whereas actually what, especially with theatre, what the text, what the thing is absolutely is produced by the context it's in that sense. You can't separate text and context. They are one thing, one creates the other, and so on. So that's sort of what I was trying to explore in some ways by looking just at those attitudes to sexuality and the ways they inflect and change performance and meaning in all sorts of ways.
Brilliant, thanks. So kind of, yeah, following on from that, when you're teaching plays, I wonder, do you have other avenues to go down when you come to a play that's, you know, really rich for the themes and issues it explores, but has very few performances that students can go away and look at to inform them? How do you teach that? How do you move around that?
A lot of that. So I teach Victorian drama all the time, and there were lots of performances, but lots of them were, the texts are very, very empty. It's rather like if you read the text of Star Wars or the text of Avatar or the text of Titanic, it would look probably very crude if you're just reading the dialogue. Ship sinks, blue people, kind of jump from trees, whatever. It would look ludicrous. And in fact, that was apparently Harrison Ford's comment on the script for Star Wars, is you can type this shit, but you can't say it. Oops, sorry, am I allowed to say that? I'm going to English back inside. But anyway, that was Harrison Ford said that, not me. So in that sense, the script is a very, very small part of what those Victorian melodrama performances were. They had extraordinary, there was music for everything. There were extraordinary special effects. A lot of it was this enormous spectacle, sometimes sort of 900 extras or something involved in productions. I mean, just they were the equivalent of Hollywood films, and the script was a very small part of it. So what I've found as a way of, students tend to look at those scripts to start with, they look incredibly crude to them, incredibly unsophisticated, which is how a lot of critics have approached them. And I've found the best way to get students entering into the spirit is actually get them to write their own. And once they write their own, they get a sense of the knowingness of the audience, a sense of the skill that's involved in putting those plots together, a kind of shared humor and a shared joy in it. And the fact that the Victorian theatre is probably closer to The Simpsons in analogy, because of the idea that it's absolutely deeply bound into all the other plays that everybody's seen. So there are endless clever references and echoes, and it's a kind of knowing, shared way in which you know the conventions and are aware of the ways the conventions get subtly altered each time. And I'm talking the good episodes of The Simpsons, not necessarily the latest ones. So that set, and actually once you come to write it yourself, you're kind of entering into that, and you get a very, very different sense of the kind of skill of it and the joy of it and so on. So that's one way to sort of bring it back alive when they haven't got access to performances in the same way, and then trying to imagine it and thinking actually through things like, the analogy with film and the role that plot and dialogue plays in something that works as very powerful emotional spectacle, and not necessarily simply crude, actually often incredibly sophisticated, but has other ways of saying what it's saying.
Fab, thanks. We've got a couple of questions coming through now. First one, do you think focusing on Blanche as being a symbol of Williams's sexuality is just another way of belittling women, or of reducing their complexity to a man and his aspects, and his own aspects of his own person? Yeah,
I think, yes, there is an element of that. I think there's an element the other way round, which is the only way to give Blanche stature is to see her as the equivalent of a man. So if you see her as Tennessee Williams, then you can see her as the poet and the visionary, and perhaps her sexuality is not summing her up. So promiscuity is, exactly that reviewer who said, that Williams is suffering from this delusion that women who, a hardened prostitute, as he puts it, is capable of sort of sentimental feeling and so on. The idea that actually if a woman could have sex with more than one man, then she can't have any other qualities at all. She's not worth listening to. Whereas a man have sex with many men, but still be visionary and wise and all sorts and compassionate and all sorts of things. Yes, I think there's an element of that going on. I think in some ways that I don't want to be too judgmental, because I think in some ways it can also be about trying to free sexual desire from that kind of gendered binary and judgment, and trying to look at it as a human impulse, and a very complex human impulse often. So yes, I'm wary of some of those readings, especially if you say, Tennessee Williams is Blanche. That's just too simple. But if you look at the complex relation between them, and certainly there are elements that kind of relate between Williams's own vision and qualities and values and how he's created Blanche as a character. And the way he writes about Blanche is that absolutely Blanche is in many ways a kind of a carrier of things that are very, very important to him. But that doesn't mean she is him in some kind of simple way.
Brilliant, thanks. Would you say Stanley is a victim of societal values in a similar way to Blanche, or is it quite straightforward and easily cut that he is morally reprehensible, full stop?
No, I think it's I think in some ways, in kind of contemporary lingo, in some ways he's an example of toxic masculinity, but that's absolutely how he sees himself. So a lot of what he's got is anxiety. So the idea, and Williams is saying it, and Clermont is saying it, and so on, is he's under attack. And he fights back with the weapons he's got. And it's really important that rape is seen as an attack. It's an attempt to destroy Blanche. It's not about lust or desire or a date they've had or something like that. And that very language is one of excusing and diminishing and, all the rest of it, the act. But the fact that his status, he's an immigrant, he's working class, he feels so in sort of class and ethnic terms, he's in a position of what feels like weakness, and he's fighting. His status is as man of the house, is as provider, and his status is also importantly sexual. And that, in that sense, he's a victim of a society that the very insecurity he's suffering from, in part, come from racism. He hates being, and Blanche uses that. She calls him a Polak. It's a term of racial abuse. She has a whole sort of snobbery about him and so on. So in many ways, he's a victim in some terms, but he's the aggressor in others. And that, in many ways, Williams is absolutely looking at that sort of power struggle, and how aggression comes from insecurity in different ways.
Well, indeed, and it's making me think of what you said in your lecture, that he commented, the animals go for the animals. It's a very clear reflection of how he saw the world going on around him in a way.
Yeah, exactly that. So I think, yes, and I think also at the end of the play, it's worth thinking about how far it's a triple tragedy. That Stella is married to, she cannot let herself, she says she can't let herself believe that Stanley has raped her sister. But the very fact she won't let herself believe, she kind of knows it. And Stanley, who has fought for his status, has fought for being more than a pig, as Blanche talked about, that's what he's become. If Stella is trying to deny herself that knowledge, he knows it about himself. And in a lot of performances, he's kind of rueful at the end. There's a not so much a vulnerability as a desperation. He's destroyed his own self-image as well as Blanche. Blanche's grip on reality in that act. So I don't want to turn it all into, it's not Stanley's tragedy and the man's tragedy above all, but absolutely, I think it's a really astute comment. I think he's in some ways a victim of his society and a victim of himself.
Brilliant, thank you. A comment here: I haven't read or seen Streetcar. However, when I read Pygmalion, I think so. Yeah. It was interesting to see how in some adaptations the ending is altered into what society wanted, basically a return to the old Greek wedding.
Yes, absolutely. And that's one of the so the first production of Pygmalion is a brilliant example of exactly that way in which the play can start meaning things the author didn't intend it. So Herbert Bibb-Tree played the first Henry Higgins in the first performance of Pygmalion back in 1913. And he was a kind of matinee, sort of actor, manager, idol, all the rest of it, played opposite Mrs. Patrick Campbell, who was a hugely successful, quite a bit older than Eliza's meant to be, but she was a big theatre star of the time. And Herbert Bibb-Tree, that Shaw fought to keep that ending from being a kind of romantic ending. He wanted it an ending that asked questions about what could Eliza become now she'd moved class and all the rest of it. And he really made sure that it didn't turn into a sort of, they're going to be together in the way that happens in My Fair Lady. He then went to see the play 100 performances into its run. So it was like a celebratory 100th performance. And it had turned into a kind of like romantic ending. And and there was a point where Herbert Bibb-Tree as Higgins picked up one of the bouquets that had been thrown on stage and sort of romantically presented it to Mrs. Patrick Campbell as Eliza. And Shaw stormed backstage and ranted at Herbert Bibb-Tree, who was very puzzled by all this, and said, but my ending makes money, you should be grateful. And Shaw said, your ending is damnable, you ought to be shot. So that was Shaw unable to control the resonance of the play, because he was trying to play with that sort of romantic possibility, but not let it go there. Have it sort of the questions about if Eliza got together with Higgins, how far it would be a submission to his power, how far she would be erased in that, etc. So it's a fascinating one for the way the play keeps morphing according to who you cast there. And Shaw, when he wrote his first film script for the play, it had lots of stuff which says, sort of Higgins, who is incredibly old and unattractive and no possibility. And he was sort of trying to keep that kind of romantic ending at bay, which in no version has it been completely kept at bay. It's always part of the texture of the play.
Right. Despite it not being part of the original blueprint, as we talked about earlier.
Yeah. Well, it's something that Shaw wanted in there, but not to take out. He didn't want it to purely turn into that. But the temptation is always to romanticize. It's a good question, well spotted on that kind of link.
Yes, and so I'm aware that we are nearing the end of our stream time, but I think there's one more interesting question to put to you. What is your reading of the character of Mitch and the way his relationship with Blanche develops relating to this sense of masculinity?
Yeah, really good question. And I think if we're talking about toxic masculinity, then absolutely it sort of poisons Mitch's life. So that way in which he's sort of ill at ease with the company of men in some ways, those men, he's seen as a misfit there. He's sort of teased for his courtesy, his old worldliness, his love of his mother and so on. And the sense that he could have been happy with Blanche, the sense that, he's got these misogynist attitudes where finding out that she's had sex with a load of men means she's worthless, she's tricked him, all the rest of it. Her need to play the kind of virgin to appeal to him, that sense that that's the only form in which he can see female value. And he's missed something through that, just as Blanche has. And his sort of crude attempt to rape her, which he just brushes off, the very fact that he sees that as the way to respond, but not wholehearted,ly, there's a sort of way in which he's caught between expectations and types of masculinity and so on. And I think, he's left pretty empty at the end of the play. That was a possibility for him as much as it was a possibility for Blanche, and it's cut off. So different actors have played Mitch as more sensitive or more sort of, he's described in early productions as being like a bear dancing. So he's got that sort of lumbering hugeness, but a different kind of delicacy potentially there, and awkwardness, but also a kind of weight to him. Right. Okay. So he's a fascinating kind of counter to Stanley in lots of ways.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, I think we have run over a little bit, so I think we'll have to end it there. But thank you very much, Sos. That was a really engaging lecture, and thank you everybody who left a question and a comment. This is just an example of the teaching you can expect at Oxford University. So if you like what you've heard and you want to be where I am, asking the questions and engaging, then apply, and hopefully you will be sat in a room with Sos talking about plays and all the wonderful interpretations we can make of them.
Absolutely, so I can learn from your ideas about Streetcar. That would be a joy.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Everybody. Thank you, Sos, and thank you, everybody. We hope to See you soon.